Dober dan. Bomo kar začeli, ne bomo čakali še akademskih 15. Ime je Barbara in vas v imenu Gibanja za pravice Palestincev lepo pozdravljam. Smo zelo veseli, da ste se nam danes pridružili in da imamo tukaj profesorja Richarda Falka, ki bo kmalu z nami delil svoje razmišljanja o Palestini. Nam se zdi, da taki dogodki so pomembni. Na nek način nas opominjajo na to, da pač je v Palestini potrebno nenehno govoriti, ne samo takrat, kadar je Palestina v svetovnih medijih, ampak tudi takrat, ko je ni. Mi smo, odkar delujemo v teh 6 letih, zato poskušali organizirati razne dogodke, smo povabili goste iz Palestine in iz Izraela in Amerike in Evrope in na tak način nekako poskušamo odpirati prostor za palestinsko zgodbo, pa tudi na nek skromen način pokazati solidarnost s Palestinci. Nastali smo pred 6 leti predvsem kot odgovor na poziv palestinske civilne družbe k bojkotu, dezinvesticijam in sankcijam proti Izraelu, dokler ta ne prične spoštovati mednarodnega prava in pravic Palestincev. In zato smo v teh 6 letih poleg tovrstnih javnih dogodkov poskušamo tudi organizirati razne kampanje bojkota, delujemo pa tudi na področju zagovorništva tako na ravni Slovenije kot Evropske unije. Enkrat mesečno tudi poširjamo elektronske novice o raznih dogajanjih, aktivnostih. Če bi kogarkoli zanimalo, da te novice prejema, bom poslala tole naokoli, pa lahko tukaj pol napišete svojo elektronsko pošto, vedno se pa lahko potem od tega odjavite. Pogovor bo potekal v angleščini, ne bo predavanja, ne bo prevoda. Bi pa še dodala, da je gospod Falk prosil, da vsa vprašanja napišete na kakšen listek, da bo mu za lažje razumevanje. Tako da jaz bom razdelila te listke in kdorkoli ima eno vprašanje, potem na koncu bi prosila, da napišete, pa bom jaz to pobrala in potem dala gospodu Falku.
Barbara, jutri pripravni na pravni.
Pa še omenila bi, da jutri ob 13. uri, pa tudi na pravni fakulteti, bo imel gospod Falk predavanje America and World Order. Nekaj takega, se upravičujem, zelo sem pozabila, ampak lahko tudi pogledate na spletni strani. Tako da vabljeni tudi tja. Zdaj bi pa pač predala besedo novinarki Kristini Božič, ki bo tudi pogovor vodila in gospoda Falka predstavila. Tako da hvala lepa.
Jaz bom sem še dodala, da se slišimo, da če bodo kakšne vprašanja pa še naknadno, pa da jih ne boste uspeli napisati na listek, da jih bomo vsem še zbirali, pa pobirali, pa prevajali, pa nekako. Ampak glede na želje gosta smo rekli, da poskušamo to še tako organizirati. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to welcome you in Ljubljana, finally. Professor Richard Falk has worked at Princeton University for decades. He is a professor of international law and international politics, and he has also been a special rapporteur for human rights in Palestine between 2008 and 2014. He's author of many books, studies, and he also writes a blog where he always very carefully, precisely, and with a great insight somehow explains the events, injustices, and ways forward for all of us, perhaps, who have less experience on the world stage of politics and fight for justice. He has been to South Africa in the 1990s, or at the beginning of the 1990s as well. And last year he co-authored a report that was commissioned by the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia that looked into apartheid policies in Israel over Palestinians. And the report got quite a welcome. It was especially from the US ambassador at the UN. Was criticized and under pressure. The link to the report was also removed from the UN website. However, the report was never repudiated. It was never said that the content of the arguments or of the realizations and crimes that you described is wrong, or that your arguments don't stand. Apartheid is one of the crimes against humanity. It's a serious allegation, and I'm wondering what somehow provoked the writing of the report, and what does it tell us about the situation in Palestine today?
Well, thank you very much for your gracious words, and I'm very happy to be here with everyone in the room, old friends that have emerged and new friends that are emerging. And of course, Ljubljana is a beautiful city, and that makes the experience even more satisfying. But the question why I wrote that report, it wasn't my initiative. The UN Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, what they call ESQA in UN jargon, approached me, and I in turn realized that I needed a co-author, and I approached Virginia Tilley, who's a historian who had specialized in the study of apartheid and had lived in South Africa and had worked a lot in recent years on the relationship between Israel and South Africa and how that should be understood. So we tried to do it as an academic study, whether the policies and practices of Israel toward the Palestinian people amounted, from our judgment, to give credibility to this allegation, as you say, very serious allegation of the crime of apartheid. We didn't pretend to be a tribunal making a formal legal judgment. This was an academic study, and it isn't even a UN position. The study included the usual disclaimer that the report represented the views of the authors, but not necessarily the views of the Commission. So the attack on the UN for issuing this report was really rather misguided, and because there's no question that this was a theme that had emerged in recent discussions of the nature of Israeli control over the Palestinians. And indeed, the Israeli attack on the use of the word apartheid was itself rather hypocritical, because in Israeli internal discourse inside Israel in Hebrew, all the way back to David Ben-Gurion, the first leader of Israel, they often used themselves the terminology of apartheid and said, if we don't solve the Palestinian problem, we're going to become an apartheid state. And that was said as recently as by Olmert and more recent the Israeli Attorney General. So it's hypocritical for them when Jimmy Carter, for instance, titled his book Peace or Apartheid, something like that, he was immediately attacked as an anti-Semite. So it's a kind of polemical way of saying we don't want the world to talk the way we talk ourselves internally. And that's important, I think, in understanding part of the background. And the attack by Ambassador Haley in the UN had absolutely nothing to say about the substance of the report. It attacked me personally as somehow a strange person in some ways. She didn't go into great detail about my lack of qualifications, but it's part of a broader Israeli strategy that I encountered while I was special rapporteur for in the UN, to try to kill the messenger rather than discuss the message. And it is a quite insidious technique, because even if you don't kill the messenger, I'm still alive, more or less. What you do is you shift the conversation from the substantive issues to whether these allegations are true or not, or somewhat true, or so it puts you in a position of defending yourself rather than defending the analysis and the substance of what you're dealing with. And it's an interesting shift, in my view, by Israel over the last decade. I think that they understand that their substantive positions are too weak to defend, and therefore it's easier and more effective to do this effort, to make this effort to shift the conversation. I have often said to people, you only have to be 10% objective to come to the same conclusions that I came to about the nature of Israeli violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights standards. Now, coming to the report itself briefly, there were two things that I think make the report significant that are not easily or not commonly understood or talked about. The first is that we address the situation not in the occupied territory, where a lot of people have said this is two systems of law, one for the settlers, one for the Palestinians. It's discriminatory and exploitative. It's not a big stretch to say this is a kind of form of apartheid. But what we insisted on doing, and the ESQA wanted us to do this, was to say, is it reasonable to conclude that Israel's policies and practices toward the Palestinian people as a whole, see, that's the important, those three words, as a whole, constitutes apartheid. And as a whole shifts the conversation about the core of the conflict from territory to people. See, that's very important, because the whole diplomacy was based on this formula, land for people. But that essentially forgets the refugees that are the largest group of Palestinians, 5 to 7 million. And it also ignores the involuntary exiles. It also overlooks the minority living within Israel, the 20% minority. So what we wanted to do was to examine these allegations of apartheid in relation to all these separate categories of Palestinians, particularly those living under occupation, those living as a discriminated minority, those living in refugee camps in neighboring countries, and dispersed around the world. And that was against the background of saying that Israel deliberately, from its inception, wanted to fragment the Palestinians, to keep them as fractionated as possible, as separate as possible, in order to prevent their accumulated power being used as a political instrument. And this goes to a very deep part of the puzzle that confronted the Zionist movement, is how do we establish a democratic Jewish state in a majority Palestinian country? In other words, how do we establish our own state in another people's homeland? See, that was the puzzle from the beginning. And we want to not only establish a state, we want it to be a democratic, legitimate state from a constitutional perspective. Now, how do we do that? Considering that at the time of the Balfour Declaration, for instance, which was the original sort of pledge by Britain of support for the establishment of this Jewish homeland in Palestine, the Jewish population was 5 to 6% of the total. By the time that the partition resolution came in 1947, even though there was this strenuous effort and it coincided with the rise of Nazism and the Jewish refugees who were encouraged to come to Palestine, still in 47 the Jewish population of Palestine was about 30%. And even the partition part, Jews were a minority in the part that had been assigned for the formation of Israel. So the puzzle was, how do we combine establishing an independent state and making it democratic? And that meant we had to get rid of a lot of Palestinians. Ethnic cleansing was indispensable to the establishment of Palestine in any kind of sustainable democratic way. And all along, in the internal Israeli and Zionist conversations, is this recurrent fear of what they call the demographic bomb, the sense that Palestinians will become somehow or other a sufficient political force to threaten Jewish control. So that's one. Perhaps I'm answering at too great length for you're being very patient so far. So the other aspect of this emphasis on Palestinian people as a whole, as victims of an apartheid regime, apartheid state, is to say, to challenge the notion in international circles that the path to peace is to end the occupation. That's, of course, from Palestinian point of view, that's a good thing, but it doesn't address the core issue of the victimization and subjugation of the Palestinian people. To do that, you have to end apartheid. And that means you have to dismantle these structures of exploitative subjugation. And what the crime of apartheid consists of in international law, there's an international convention that was passed in 1973, and then as Christina mentioned, it's incorporated as one of the crimes against humanity in Article 7 of the Statute of the International Criminal Court. And what the preliminary observation is that apartheid as a crime is not tied to the experience of racism in South Africa. It can resemble or not resemble. The essence of the crime is the reliance on, quote unquote, inhuman acts in order to subjugate one race for the benefit of another race. And from the point of view of international law, ethnicity is treated as a race, so that Jews and Palestinians are distinct races. And the whole enterprise of establishing a Jewish state in a Palestinian society necessarily depends on subjugation and victimization. There's no other way you can, especially in an era of a post-colonial era. One of the paradoxical features of this whole Israel-Palestine story is at the very time when colonialism was collapsing all over the world, Zionism was successful in establishing a settler colonial state, swimming against the tide of history. And in that sense, it's a very impressive project that overcame all kinds of obstacles and was able to manipulate political forces in such a way as to do this. But what seemed to us clear from examining the policies and practices that Israel relied upon in relation to the refugees, in relation to the Palestinian population in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Israel itself, all had the same features of subjugating the Palestinian people so as to sustain this reality of a Jewish state in a Palestinian society. And it's on that central basis that we came to this conclusion that from an academic point of view, that it was reasonable to believe that the Palestinian people as a whole were victims of the crime of apartheid, and that the international community had a responsibility to act in response to this set of circumstances. That's a terribly long answer to your very short question.
Does this change, or how does this, in your view, change how we see Palestine today, or how does the change from talking about ending occupation to ending apartheid change the fight in a way? And I'll take a little bit more space. It's interesting that after the Oslo Accords and the so-called peace process, the question of refugees and East Jerusalem, and I think there were some things that were put off the table for the time being, so as to deal with later on when other topics will be somehow agreed upon. And it seems we're seeing a return to the questions that you say are basic. And also what we saw in Gaza on Friday, these were the marches or the protests that wanted to remind the world of the right of return of the refugees. So how to understand this comeback, in a way, to the basics, to international law, what BDS says all along. We want Israel to respect and abide by international law and its international obligations.
Well, you pose two connected questions. First of all, how does apartheid change our understanding of the conflict? And as I tried to say, it changes it by broadening the agenda, the core agenda for a genuine peace process must be expanded beyond having Israel withdraw from the territories it occupied in 1967. And it makes these issues that you just brought up, like refugees and the status of Jerusalem and the right of return, all those issues become not marginal, but core issues. So it changes the agenda. And it also poses a challenge to Israel and Zionism. If we accept that change of agenda, how do we maintain the claim of being a Jewish state in a Palestinian, this is sort of shorthand, being a Jewish state in a Palestinian society. And that's a problem, if you think about it, that's a problematic claim taken on its own. When you have different peoples living within the borders of sovereign states, and you affirm the equality of people within a framework of human rights, the idea of having an ethnic state or a religious state seems inconsistent with the modern notion of a legitimate state, because a legitimate state treats everyone under its authority with equality. That's the spirit of equality is the essential embodiment of a democratic system. So as soon as you say, in my view, the deeper question that is posed is not only how do we make peace with the Palestinians, but how do we make peace with ourselves? Having made this, and can we find a way to live together in a sustained, peaceful manner without subjugating one people to the other? See, and the Palestinian voices of most influential voices like Edward Said or Marwan Darwish, they never have called for the expulsion of Jews or the reversal of history. What they've called for is equality. And Edward in particular also called for some kind of historical reckoning, that you can't ignore the injustices endured by the Palestinian people. You have to have something like a commission of peace and reconciliation, the kind of thing that they did do in South Africa. So it's, in my view, it's an essential shift of emphasis and inquiry to allow or to encourage the political and moral imagination to equate peace with the end of apartheid rather than the withdrawal from occupation. The withdrawal from occupation is still a part of ending apartheid, but it's a part, not the essence at this in this kind of understanding. Now, the second part of your question is, why have these issues seemingly reemerged in the form of Palestinian resistance, of BDS campaign, the general global solidarity movement, even the discourse within the United Nations and elsewhere? And I think there are several tentative kind of answers to that question. One of them is that diplomacy has clearly failed, that it was given more than 20 years of opportunity to produce some kind of peace, and what it did was to enhance the territorial position of the Israelis and diminish the territorial position of the Palestinians via the settlement phenomena, via the establishment of the unlawful separation wall, and a number of other developments that really undercut the sense. You know, the conventional wisdom was the peace process failed for both sides. That's not true. It failed for the Palestinian side, but it succeeded for the Israeli side. They got what they wanted from that Oslo diplomacy, which was to deflect the claims to establish an independent Palestinian state and to expand the settlements beyond thresholds of reversibility. In other words, no sane person thinks that an Israeli leader will agree to removing 700,000 or more settlers. And so there is a kind of obvious false consciousness that is associated with the way governments continue to say that the important thing is to revive negotiations for a two-state solution. Almost every government continues to say that, as if that's a possibility, and they don't say how, or they don't face the how question. And it's not only the irreversibility of the settlement phenomena, it's also that the Israeli leadership doesn't want a Palestinian state. They've made it very clear in their internal dialogue with their own people. Netanyahu said before his last election, there will never be a Palestinian state so long as I'm the leader of Israel. But the West chose to ignore that because they didn't know what else to say. See, and they didn't want to completely abandon the issue. And at the same time, they didn't want to be serious politically about addressing the issue. Because if they were serious politically, they would do what they do when they are serious politically. They impose sanctions, they put pressure, they don't just say what the international community said after this Land Day celebration, urging both sides to exercise restraint. You know, that's kind of the typical response, or to indicate that there was some kind of equivalent responsibility that makes it impossible to distinguish between right and wrong, or victim and perpetrator, which is, as I say, a kind of false consciousness. So the essential reason that these issues are reemerging is diplomacy has failed, and above all, the Palestinian people living in these different situations understand that, and have understood it for some time. The Palestinian, part of the confusion is the Palestinian Authority itself subscribes to this two-state mantra. And so they're partly because they depended on funding, they want to deal in an intergovernmental setting and in the UN, and they feel their best hopes are to gain status as an independent political actor. And there's something to that argument. Now, I think the other main reason these issues have come up is because, as you suggested, Palestinian people don't want to be forgotten. And they Israel is pushing the line, whatever you may think about this struggle, we won, Palestinians lost, and we should move on. See, that's the dominant Palestinian Israeli narrative at the moment. It's irrelevant whether you think you're sympathetic with the Palestinians or you're supportive of us. The important thing is to recognize one side won, the other side lost. We should move on. And that's what diplomats will tell you quietly if they're not to be, off the record. A lot of Western diplomats subscribe to this view, and Israel has been very clever in sort of pushing that. And then there's some strong sort of right-wing Zionists in the American context, led by Daniel Pipes, that might be a name familiar to some of you that have followed these issues, who's organized what he calls a victory caucus. And what he urges, and has got some members of the US Congress and of the Israeli Knesset to subscribe to this idea, what he's urging is that Israel increase its reliance on force to make the Palestinians wake up to the reality of their defeat, and to make them, in effect, politically surrender by acknowledging their willingness to accept their status underneath a Jewish state, or to live within a Jewish state. And that sort of suggests this other Israeli goal at the moment, which is the one-state solution from an Israeli point of view. Not for, there was the Edward Said version of the one-state solution of equality of the two peoples. The Israeli version is the hegemony of the Jewish people within a single state where the boundaries resemble what Zionists claim to be the promised land of biblical Israel, which is, of course, a kind of political myth, but it's a powerful political myth in this effort to depict a solution, a kind of imposed solution, and the completion of the Zionist project. See, and that's the way a lot of Israelis are thinking about the present context, is how do we complete the Zionist project? We have a favorable regional situation. Saudi Arabia and Egypt, the two most important Arab countries, want our cooperation in their struggle with Iran and to control the region. The other part of that notion of this being Israel's time to complete the end game, so to speak, is that we couldn't have a more receptive American president. We lived with Obama, and even though he did 95% of what Israel wanted, he didn't quite go 100%. And at the end, he was very annoyed with what he felt to be the obstructive tactics of Netanyahu. But Trump and his Middle East advisors go 150%. They go beyond what Netanyahu himself would urge. So if you look at the regional situation, the internal expansion of the settlement phenomena, the U.S. Acceptance of whatever Israel wants to do is climaxed with the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and the commitment to move the American embassy to Jerusalem, which shatters the international consensus on this issue that had been built around the idea that Jerusalem was one of those issues that would be resolved only through negotiations between the two parties. And even America's closest allies, like France and UK, Japan, all voted to censure the American initiative with respect to Jerusalem. It was a vote of 125 to 8 in the UN General Assembly last December, which is a astoundingly one-sided vote, especially if you look at who the 8 were. Aside from Israel and the US, it was several completely dependent Pacific Island countries that most of you had never heard of, much less visited, and a couple of Central American states that were very dependent on US assistance and had a lot of US corporate money invested in. So there was a definite repudiation of this act. What that repudiation means politically in the future is hard to know, but it does suggest that at least at the symbolic level, the international community is not prepared to follow Trump down that road, at least not at the present time. Another too long answer. Sorry for that.
Good. Perhaps my first very short question would be, where do you see the role of EU in all of this? It's one of the most important financiers of Palestinian.
Well, that's a question I should be asking you. But
sometimes looking from the outside
okay.
helps to.
No, I think the Palestinians would hope that one of the positive side effects of the Trump diplomacy is that Europe sees an opportunity to play a more independent, more balanced role. And Europe, I think, still suffers from, in foreign policy, from what one might call a Cold War syndrome of not wanting to challenge its big brother. And even though they're privately extremely unhappy with the Trump kind of diplomacy, not only with respect to Israel-Palestine, but more generally, they don't yet see, or at least they haven't exhibited, a willingness to act independently. France has sort of flirted with the idea from time to time, but not in any sustainable or effective way. And then I think what I said earlier, I think a lot of European diplomats are privately cynical about the capacity to do anything to really find a peace formula. They accept this Israeli narrative that Palestinians have lost the struggle. And even though they don't want to admit that publicly, partly for relations with the wider Islamic world and their own Islamic populations and so on, they are not prepared to do something serious about trying to move the relationship onto a more productive path. And you see this great contrast now between the intergovernmental responses to something like the Land Day demonstrations and the civil society responses. The intergovernmental responses are, as I say, not passing judgments, saying avoid the violence, exercise restraint. Civil society overwhelming response is, this was a massacre, we have to do something, and we propose, as the BDS leadership did, an arms embargo on Israel in response. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the right initiative, but the instinct of civil society is a serious political instinct. It is, we want to help the Palestinians achieve their rights. And they've lived in a, they've suffered long enough, too long. And you compare that with this intergovernmental response, which is, we don't want to get too involved. Let them, let it take its own course. Let this conflict, for whatever it is, take its own course. And that, in effect, is giving a green light to Israel to do what it wants, since it has the hard power control over the situation. So I don't know what the, I mean, public opinion here could make a difference. Mobilization of Jeremy Corbyn, if he succeeds in Britain, would make a difference. I know from personal contact that he cares about these issues, and he is he would be in a position, of course he'd be attacked wildly, as he already is, and very unfairly, of course. But you need, and maybe Macron, if he gets annoyed enough with Trump, would take some initiative. I don't think that Germany will do anything, and Germany is still very nervous about being seen as a critical of Israel because of the Holocaust memories and the rise of the radical right in Germany itself are inhibiting factors. And I think that more generally in the EU, this rise of the radical right is not an encouraging development for a positive EU response.
Now it seems it's easy to forget how cruel and very direct occupation and apartheid policies are. And it's, I think a few days ago there was an article about the report that Ministry for Education in Palestine prepared about how schools in Palestine, in the West Bank, are in danger of being demolished because the wall is to be somehow prolonged and made bigger. And many school children have to walk to school because the army somehow doesn't allow the buses to pass, and when they walk, they come with the helicopters to raise the dust, and children have many problems. They get arrested, they get imprisoned. So it seems, I mean, and reading that, it makes one angry. And I remember you quoting someone, and I will not remember neither the quote perfectly nor the person. I think it's a Jewish academic, that it's a guilt of a few, but responsibility of all of us.
No. Yes, that's a quote from Abraham Heschel, the Jewish philosopher. Few are guilty, but all are responsible.
In this context, you keep hope. You believe in the power of people, And yet it seems, even looking at European movements and BDS, sometimes we are really hopeful, but at other times we feel desperately inadequate, or without tools how to affect change that we would perceive as real change. And as a professor of international law, international politics, what has happened to us? I mean, how have we lost this knowledge of how to be a democratic citizens in
That's
the
quite
modern
a deep
world?
challenge. I think to be hopeful about, to have hope, to hold on to hope, which is essentially to avoid despair, you need to be a long-distance runner. You know, you have to be willing. I learned a lot from the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. They had their leadership had a 50-year horizon of hope.
We have a 50 year of okay.
I mean, that didn't mean they wanted the war to last 50 years, but they were psychologically and politically prepared to resist for 50 years if that was what was necessary. See, and particularly, I'm not as familiar with the European mood about these kind of things, but the American political culture suffers from a kind of quick fix obsession. If you can't get something done immediately, it doesn't get done at all, especially with civil society initiatives. It's very hard to make something persevere. And in this situation, where there are two things. One is patience and perseverance. The other is humility. We are not smart enough to be pessimistic, because to be pessimistic means you understand the future. And all the things that have happened in many of the biggest changes that have happened in my lifetime were unpredictable until after they happened, and then experts like myself come along and tell you they had explain why they had to happen, but only after they happened. And that includes collapse of the Soviet Union, the eruption of the Arab Spring, the counter-revolutions against the Arab Spring, the collapse of apartheid. All these developments were completely unpredicted. I think I mentioned to you that when I was in South Africa, and I was there as a sort of, in a kind of role of being involved in one of the political trials there. I spoke to people across the spectrum of outlooks. Not one of them thought that it was even worth contemplating the Afrikaner regime releasing Nelson Mandela from prison. They thought that was, if you were thinking along that line, you were out of the picture. You were not worth, you had lost contact with reality. And yet, 3 years later, that happened. And it's a lesson in humility, because people were convinced that what was going to happen was a bloody armed struggle for the future of the country. And that the Afrikaners, who I talked to quite a bit, they said, it's either them or us. And we will, similar to what Israelis will also say, we would rather die than give in and live as a minority in an African-run society. So it's a very, there are a lot of differences between the two situations, but you can learn a lot from trying to interpret what did happen in South Africa that made very intelligent people on different parts of the ethnic and ideological spectrum not grasp the hopeful possibility in their situation. See, we can ask that about the Palestinian reality now. What makes us unable to grasp that hopeful possibility? And it is, to some extent, the conventional limits of the political and moral imagination, which is shaped a lot by the mainstream media and by political leaders. They sort of teach us not to think outside the box. We learn not to, especially academic people, learn not to seem foolish. And you seem foolish if you're suggesting things that don't seem likely to happen given the current configuration of forces that exist. So that's another one of my long answers that is probably not satisfying to you, but I won't judge your response.
I think then it's best that we see if there are any responses from the audience.
There's one for sure.
Okay.
Which do you want me to answer first?
As you,
The easy one or the...
I think we start with the hard ones.
Yes.
Oh. I was afraid you'd say that. Let me read the question. Some scholars who support and sympathize with the Palestinian question oppose BDS, saying that it must recognize Israel's right of existence. How would you confront such a point that some of them mention, like Dr. Norman Finkelstein, who happened to be my student years ago? He got his PhD at my university, and I was his main advisor at the end of the thesis process. And I think he may have changed his, I'm not familiar with his most recent views on BDS, but I have a certain sense that he's at least softened his opposition, if not changed it. And he's incidentally published just now a very fine book on Gaza, probably the best thing in the English language on the whole history and development of the Gazan experience, which is a very important chapter or part of the total issue. I think there is a point to this kind of concern of making Israelis feel that they could enter a genuine peace process without feeling that they are at risk of being annihilated. Now, how you formulate that reassurance and whether the timing is, they're trying to make the Palestinians disappear. So it's the timing of making this kind of reassurance is important. As I mentioned in my earlier remarks, Edward Said and Ibrahim Abu Lugo and other very influential voices of the Palestinian people always assured audiences of their commitment to the right of Jews to exist in whatever political framework emerged from a genuine peace process. Now, when you say Israel's right to exist, that becomes ambiguous, because if that means the right of a Jewish state to exist in a Palestinian society, that becomes somewhat more questionable. And I can understand a reluctance to formulate a reassurance that Jews have some kind of right of self-determination, but it's not a right that extends to extinguishing the rights of others. And that goes for the Palestinians too. They have no right to assert a political future that denies basic rights of other people, non-Palestinians. So I think if you accept that normative understanding, then the idea of mutual reassurance is part of a genuine peace process and creating the preconditions for peace. And I welcome the question was an important and helpful one, I think. The Prime Minister, is that correct, Prime Minister? Pete?
I'm receiving quite a lot.
Oh, I'm receiving quite a lot of messages from pro-Palestinian groups working in the U.S. Are they quite known? Well, it depends. I don't know what groups are sending you these messages. So
It's quite serious groups. Yes.
oh yes, they're
Like civil groups. Civil people. And
oh yeah. In fact, they're so well known that there's all kinds of legislative activity to prohibit them and to punish them. So that no, they're very prominent in university settings, and to some extent in church settings, and occasionally in labor settings. Those three kind of venues that are important, of course, in public changing public opinion. And there's one of the important changes in the American political landscape is that younger Jews are much less attracted to the Zionist narrative than are their parents and grandparents, and are much less interested in it, and are basically quite divided about how to think about their own relationship to Israel and to Zionism. What can be expected from the Arab League? The Arab League, like other regional groupings, is a organization of its members, and therefore, and particularly of its most influential members. And in that sense, it would be unrealistic in the Israel-Palestine context, given the present pattern of Arab leadership, to expect very much from the Arab League at this point, at least in its public postures. I think some of the private views of the leadership of the Arab League are quite eager to help the Palestinians. And one of the important gaps in the regional situation in the Middle East is that the governments want to see their own stability and interests as normalizing relations with Israel, while their citizens don't. So you have this tension between not pro-Israeli, but at least pragmatically pro-Israeli Arab governments, particularly Saudi Arabia and Egypt, as I said earlier, and a citizenry that is very much in solidarity with the Palestinians. And part of the Arab situation at the present time is that these governments see the Palestinian movement as a movement from below, a democratizing movement. And that scares these monarchies and dictatorships. You know, Saudi Arabia, as sectarian as it is, in terms of Sunni Islam, intervened as much as it could to crush the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which was, you would have thought they would be a natural partner for Saudi Arabia. It's a Sunni movement and with deep popular roots in Egyptian society. And so you have to ask, why did Saudi Arabia side with a secular military coup against the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a devout Islamic Sunni constellation of forces? And if you answer that question, you understand one aspect of the complexity in the Arab world in relation to these kind of issues. In other words, Saudi Arabia is sectarian when it comes to Iran, but it's the opposite of sectarian when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood. Because the Muslim Brotherhood is a movement from below. They want politics to be from above. And that's naturally part of the monarchical worldview. You're making up these questions. They keep coming. For free democratic Palestine, Hamas is polluting this case. What should we do for that? Well, I don't know what is meant by Hamas polluting this case. Hamas has done things that are very bad in the past, but since it was encouraged to participate in the 2006 elections in Gaza, and it was never forgiven for winning those elections. You know, it was very much encouraged. It was told, adopt a political track and you can participate in politics, enter the elections, and it did. But Israel influenced the US to say, we don't want them. They have to stay in this terrorist box. And they're more useful to us as terrorists, because then we can, especially after the American attacks, September 11th attacks, as long as you call the adversary a terrorist, you can do anything. And it was a way of exerting unrestricted power. Hamas, as has been documented, reached out to Bush after they got elected, and said, unless you find a way to bring peace, or at least peaceful coexistence, in the relations between Gaza and Israel, there's going to be terrible suffering and violence. That initiative was never responded to. It was made privately, and there's no question in my mind that Hamas has wanted a format of peaceful coexistence for the last decade. They've chosen the political track, and they haven't renounced violence, but they only use violence when they're attacked. With some, there's some extremist elements within their movement, but the leadership has basically felt, for probably pragmatic reasons, that their best hope is through political strategy. They've offered Israel proposals for 50 years of peaceful coexistence that Israel has never responded to, never explored. So I think it's a reflection of mainstream anti-terrorist kind of thinking to keep Hamas in this kind of box of evil terrorism, which I don't think characterizes either their leadership or their behavior in recent years. So I think, to answer your question, probably not in the way you want me to answer it, is to say rethink your understanding of Hamas and assess whether they really could be induced to participate constructively in a genuine peace process. My impression from talking with some of their leaders is that they are quite ready to do that and don't want to prolong the suffering of the Palestinian people. They're not alienated from their own people, is another way of putting it. And to adhere to a genuine terrorist tactic would be to inflict incredible suffering, because as long as you play the game on a military or paramilitary terrain, you give all the advantages to Israel. It's completely dominant in the hard power confrontation. So from a completely practical point of view, it makes no sense from a Palestinian point of view to challenge Israel by systematic forms of violence like the suicide bombing campaign was in the 1990s, which I think they engaged in, but they then rejected. What would be the precise political actions to be taken in order to achieve equality and justice in Palestine in case of a one-state solution? The easy answer to that is negotiate the end of apartheid. And because by negotiating the end of apartheid, you're really saying you want people to live within whatever political community emerges on the basis of equality. And equality would imply justice. And that's the only, at least I don't have the idea of any other way of living together in a sustainable, peaceful manner. Because the only other way is to say some people are better than others and deserve to or have the capacity to govern others in this kind of hegemonic way. And that the others that are being subjugated aren't in this post-colonial era going to accept that. So you have to be more and more repressive to make it work. And that, if you followed the story of Israel's control over the Palestinian people, you see that it's had this progression toward more and more repressive tactics. And that's, it's the logic of the situation. It doesn't mean that Israel is necessarily evil in doing that, but they can't maintain control unless they intimidate sufficiently to subjugate. See, the whole logic of this kind of domination is, how do you make a people accept their victimization? How can you make them do that? And you can only make them do that by inflicting pain. They're not going to do that by being told you're inferior, or we have a mandate from heaven, or we're in our promised land. That's not going to work. And in the one-state solution, from this more just and equitable point of view, takes a lot of thought and a lot of preparation, because there are such disparities in wealth and experience and education, and that you can't bring together two peoples immediately that have had such different experiences. So it has to be a somewhat phased, gradual process. But if the will is there, it can be managed. And again, the South African example is both cautionary and encouraging. It's cautionary in the sense that there still are important remnants of social, cultural, and economic apartheid present in the post-apartheid political South Africa. It's encouraging in the sense that this transition has been made in ways that have been accepted by both peoples, and they do live together in a manner that is quite impressive, especially when you compare it with the violence in the other African countries that have not had this kind of difficult background.
Two more? Is it okay?
Any anti-Semitism criticism. Any criticism against the government of the State of Israel is immediately labeled as anti-Semitism. Then on the other side, there is real anti-Semitism in Europe.
That often, I think, hides under...
Which often is legitimized as...
Anti-Zionism.
As anti-Zionism and
not, I think, anti-Zionism and not as anti-Semitism. So it's claiming it's anti-Zionist, but it's actually anti...
Yeah, it's an important question that's somewhat difficult to answer without a lot of examples, because there is what they call the new anti-Semitism is what is described as excessive criticism of Israel. Now, what is excessive? And if Israel acts in an excessive way, shouldn't the criticism correspond with the behavior in some sense? And then, as I say, the Zionists themselves have used this tactic to attack people like myself. And whatever faults I have, and there are many, one of them isn't being an anti-Semite. I mean, in the sense of hatred of Jews or hatred of any ethnicity for that matter. And so it's a deliberate falsification of this kind of pattern that has, in its genuine form, caused great suffering, but now is used as a way of not acknowledging the suffering of the Palestinians. See, it's very perverse in that sense. The exaggerated accusations of anti-Semitism put a cloud over the ordeal that the Palestinian people are expressing. And it's used as a tactic of intimidation, of discrediting, of shifting the conversation, of weakening the BDS campaign, of all kinds of items. And I think the only thing one can do is to try to make at least responsible Zionists understand that this is a very costly tactic for them to employ, and to make public understand the differences between genuine anti-Semitism and this kind of allegation of anti-Semitism. I mentioned last night that I was quite flattered by being called the third most dangerous anti-Semite in the world. And this was, the Weizmann Institute puts out a list every year of the 10 most dangerous anti-Semites. And I thought I convinced me I was doing a good job in my UN position when I discovered that the first two were the Supreme Guide of Iran and the Prime Minister of Turkey. And so people were very jealous. People were very jealous of my high ranking.
And great power.
Well, I don't know about that, but this is a 10-part question.
This was probably the most interesting. How would you comment the concept of lawfare?
How would you concept? Oh, yes. Well, that's an interesting question. How would you comment on the concept of lawfare as used by Israelis? The Israelis, imitating in that sense some of the post-9/11 commentary in the U.S., began to say those who rely on law to advance their political arguments about rights are engaging in a form of warfare with law as its instrument, and that this is a unacceptable weapon of the weak. And it's a strange argument in a way, but it's the complaint, essentially, of the misuse of law in order to push a political agenda. The other part of the question, what is the impact of civil society in relation to diplomacy and military efforts? Could Parliament actively be more active on an equal footing based on the efforts of civil society and diplomatic?
Causing the diplomatic war.
Well, if I understand correctly,
My question.
Okay.
I thought more in relation to what can be the impact of civil society if, in relation to, for example, diplomacy. So, for example, if he said the Palestinians lost the diplomatic war, but how can the civil society help them? Do they still need to win with some kind of military means or on the diplomatic field, or how do these, like diplomacy, civil society, and military?
No, it's a complicated, good question. And it's not an evasion, but it's, I think, accurate to say it varies with the political context. In other words, the answer is different in the US than it would be here, or would be in France or India or other places. So that the first thing is to look at the reality of the society, and there are some societies where the legislative branch is much more responsive to these kind of sentiments in civil society, particularly if it's a really independent body that is not subject to either control from the ruler or discipline from the party. So I think it's important to use what leverage there is to influence parliamentary attitudes toward these issues. And that in turn can influence the media and the general conversation that takes place within a country that then does have a diplomatic spillover. So these things are all interrelated and hard to give a kind of very bottom line answer, but it's an important way of thinking and looking at the set of problems that confront us. Thank you for all these questions. They were a good challenge.
I will also just say thank you very much for being here and sharing with us all the insights and important points of view. And I think, for me, the most actually important and inspirational is your somehow persistence with optimism and not giving the fight and calling for somehow active citizenship for equality and justice. And I think that it's extremely important and a great honor that you have been here or that you are here. That you have come here and shared basically your experiences and this energy of keep going with us. Okay. Thank you also to all of you for being here with us. Hvala vsem za prijeten večer in se vidimo naslednjič.
Samo še upomnila, da kogar zanima, jutri ob enih na pravni fakulteti ima gospod Falk predavanje American Foreign Policy and its World Order, tako da ste tudi na tole povabljeni. Če kdo ni prišel do svojega vprašanja, lahko pristopite zdaj tudi k gospodu Falku in se z njim na 4 oči pogovorite. Tako da hvala.